This billionaire father had already fired 9 nannies. None of them could get a single word or movement out of his paralyzed son until a quiet maid arrived. No fancy degrees, no medical background, just patience, empathy, and a lullaby. While others gave up, she stayed. And one day, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, something happened no one believed was possible. The boy, once thought to be emotionally gone forever, stood up on his own, step by trembling step, right into her arms. The father saw it all, frozen in disbelief. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't money. It was trust, love, and consistency. This maid didn't just clean the house. She helped rebuild a broken family, and what happened next would change their lives forever. Before we continue this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love to know. After the unexpected and painful death of his wife, billionaire Charles Whitmore became a different man. Once active and admired in both business and family life, he now spends his days locked inside his enormous estate, the Whitmore estate, far from the city's hum. He lives there with his only son, Ethan, who has been confined to a wheelchair since a tragic accident no one in the family ever explained properly. Ethan cannot move his legs and hasn't spoken a single word since the day of the accident. He sits quietly, his expression blank, his world soundless. Charles tried to help at first, but over time, his efforts grew weaker. The sadness and guilt were too heavy. It became easier to bury himself in silence than to face the boy who reminded him of everything he'd lost. He has hired 9 different caregivers in the past year. All failed. None could reach Ethan. And now, the Whitmore estate is filled with an eerie stillness. Empty rooms, cold walls, the sound of footsteps muffled by grief. It feels less like a home and more like a tomb made of memories. The house itself seems frozen in time. The curtains never open. The grand piano hasn't been touched in months. Even the sunlight hesitates before entering. The staff move quietly, speaking only when necessary, as if words themselves could break what little peace remains. Charles avoids most rooms, especially the ones that remind him of Evelyn, his late wife. He spends long hours in his office staring at old photographs, pretending to work while the silence eats at him. In another part of the estate, Ethan stays mostly in his chamber, his wheelchair always in the same corner, his eyes fixed on nothing. Doctors once gave Charles hope, told him that Ethan might recover emotionally with therapy and consistency. But after months of failures and no progress, he gave up. He stopped calling specialists, stopped trying new treatments. When others suggested experimental therapies, Charles refused to listen. It was easier to believe in finality than to risk another heartbreak. But guilt has a way of living where love used to. It clings, it whispers, it builds walls higher than grief ever could. Charles blames himself, not just for the accident, but for Evelyn's death. No one knows what really happened that day, but it's clear he carries something unbearable. Rumors spread quietly among those who once worked for him, that maybe Ethan's accident and Evelyn's death were connected. But Charles never explains. He speaks to no one. The rare visitors that arrive are quickly turned away. The staff have learned not to look him in the eye. Meals are delivered to Ethan's room, untouched. The boy stares forward, unmoving, unresponsive. Every attempt to engage him fails. Every effort ends in silence. And every time a caregiver fails, Charles fires them, telling himself it's better that way. Easier to live with failure than with hope that disappoints again. The Whitmore estate, once filled with laughter, warmth, and Evelyn's piano songs, now holds only echoes of the past. The paintings on the wall look down at ghosts of the living. Until one cloudy afternoon, everything begins to change. A new maid arrives, Sophia Lane. She doesn't have degrees or references that impress. Her resume is simple, her manner unassuming. But there's something in her voice when she speaks, a stillness that feels like understanding. Charles doesn't expect much. During their first meeting, He sits behind his desk, arms crossed, barely looking at her. "You understand what you're walking into?" he says flatly. Sophia only nods. "Yes, sir. Your job is to maintain order, keep things clean, stay quiet. Don't try to talk to my son, just do what you're told." Her expression doesn't change. Understood. There's no defiance, no fear, just calm acceptance. Charles studies her for a second longer, then dismisses her with a tired wave of his hand. She starts the next morning. When Sophia first enters Ethan's chamber, she doesn't speak. She observes the dim light filtering through half-closed curtains, the faint dust in the air, the boy's stillness. His hands rest on his lap like forgotten things. His eyes, though blank, flicker faintly when she walks in. She notices it. Sophia doesn't try to make conversation. She doesn't force smiles. She simply sets to work, dusting shelves, adjusting curtains slightly, sweeping the floor, moving with the quiet rhythm of someone who knows how to coexist with silence. In the first few days, she does what others didn't. She waits. No loud encouragements, no pitying tone, no awkward games meant to stimulate interaction, just her presence, her calm, and for the first time in months, Ethan seems to notice someone. Sophia carries her own pain, though she hides it well. Something in her past has made her understand what it means to break and keep moving anyway. She never says it aloud, but it shows in the way she handles things gently, in the way she looks at Ethan, not as a patient, but as a person still fighting to exist inside silence. Charles watches from a distance. He doesn't believe any of it will matter, but there's something about this maid, something that unsettles him. She doesn't flinch around the sorrow in the house. She doesn't apologize for existing. She just shows up day after day with quiet eyes that seem to see right through the grief. The Whitmore estate has seen many caretakers come and go, but that day when Sophia Lane walked through its gates, the silence didn't end. It simply began to shift. Sophia's first morning at the Whitmore estate felt like stepping into a museum of grief. The walls carried no warmth, no sign of life, only perfection polished over decay. Every clock ticked too loud, every footstep echoed like an intrusion. The staff moved around her like ghosts, keeping their heads down, offering no conversation. No one welcomed her. No one explained routines. It didn't matter. She wasn't here to be liked. Her focus was on Ethan. The boy sat where he always did, near the window that overlooked the dead garden. A thin layer of dust coated the sill beside him. The sun poured weakly through the glass, but he never blinked toward it. Sophia didn't rush in with sympathy. She simply greeted him with a soft, "Good morning, Ethan," as she placed a clean cloth over a nearby chair. No response. She dusted quietly, her movements slow, deliberate. She noticed the faint twitch of his fingers when she moved near the record player. Not much, but enough to make her pause. That afternoon she found an old record tucked behind a stack of forgotten books, a piano piece labeled Evelyn's Melody. She placed it carefully on the player. The needle dropped with a faint hiss, and music filled the air for the first time in years. Charles, in his office, froze when he heard it. The sound drifted down the hall like a ghost from the past. He clenched his fists, wanting to storm out to stop it, but he didn't. Something in him hesitated. Sophia, unaware that he was listening, continued cleaning. Her face remained calm, but her movements slowed with the rhythm. When she glanced at Ethan, she saw his eyes shift slightly toward the sound. A tiny reaction, barely noticeable, but real. For the first time, she smiled. When the song ended, she turned off the record player, closed the curtains halfway, and whispered, "That's enough for today." That evening, Charles Whitmore stood in the hallway, leaning on the doorframe of his son's room. His expression was unreadable. "I heard the piano," he said flatly. Sophia straightened. "Yes, sir. It was covered in dust. I thought music might—" He cut her off. "Don't." His tone was low but firm. "Don't bring that sound into this house again. Sophia didn't flinch. Understood, but when he turned to leave, he saw something he hadn't seen in years, a flicker of defiance in someone's eyes. Later that night, Charles sat alone in his office, whiskey glass untouched beside him. The melody still echoed faintly in his mind, Evelyn's song. He remembered her playing that tune the night before the accident, laughter spilling through the room as Ethan clapped along. He buried his face in his hands. For years, he'd done everything to erase reminders of that night. But grief doesn't fade when you lock it away. It waits, quietly, patiently, until something soft forces it to breathe again. And somehow that something was a maid with tired eyes and calm hands. The next few days passed quietly. Sophia didn't play the record again. Instead, she spent time observing Ethan's small patterns. When sunlight shifted across the floor, his eyes followed faintly. When she dropped a feather duster accidentally, his fingers twitched. When she hummed faintly under her breath, he blinked twice in rhythm. Patterns, small, but steady. She began writing them down in a small notebook. Nothing formal, just short notes. Blink at music. Fingers move with sound. Seems calmer when light changes. Every detail mattered. At dinner, she brought the list to the kitchen and quietly asked the head cook if Ethan had any favorite foods. The cook just shrugged. "He barely eats, miss. Soup, maybe. Doesn't matter what we serve." Sophia frowned slightly. "Then maybe he's just waiting for something worth tasting." The cook didn't reply, but later that evening she found a bowl of homemade soup outside Ethan's room. Someone had listened. Days turned into weeks. The estate began to feel different. Not loud, not cheerful, but less suffocating. The air didn't hang as heavy anymore. The staff began speaking to one another again, quietly at first, then more naturally. Even Charles started leaving his office door slightly open, as if curiosity had replaced despair. One evening, as Charles passed the main hall, he stopped. Sophia sat across from Ethan, reading softly from a book. Her voice was low, steady. Ethan didn't respond, but his gaze rested near her hands, following the movement of each page. Charles watched silently for a while. Something inside him stirred, a strange mix of envy and admiration. This woman, a stranger, was connecting to his son in a way he couldn't. He turned away before she could notice. Sophia had her own ghosts, though no one at the estate knew. Late at night, after everyone slept, she'd sit by the servants' quarters window, staring out at the fog that rolled across the grounds. In another life, she had been a caretaker to someone else, a younger brother with autism, long gone now. His silence had taught her how to listen between breaths. Maybe that was why she understood Ethan. Each morning, she brought something new to his world, a book, a soft song, or a small object for him to hold. She never asked him to respond. She just stayed near. One afternoon, while cleaning, she began humming again, absent-mindedly, softly. The same melody she used to calm her brother. Ethan's fingers twitched. His lips parted slightly. Sophia kept humming, pretending not to notice. But inside, her heart pounded. A moment later, his eyes closed. Not in pain, but peace. His breathing slowed. When she stopped, he stirred faintly, almost searching for the sound again. She didn't speak of it to anyone, not even to herself. But from that day on, she hummed every morning. And every morning Ethan's eyes seemed just a little more alive. Charles, watching from the doorway one day, couldn't ignore it anymore. He noticed Ethan's hands move slightly when Sophia entered. His son's gaze followed her when she crossed the room. Still, he couldn't accept it. Hope was dangerous. Hope destroyed men like him. He told himself it meant nothing, that his son was reacting to routine, not care. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered something else. She's reaching him. That thought alone terrified him, because if Sophia could succeed where he had failed, what did that make him? Later that night, Charles opened a drawer in his office and pulled out a photograph. Evelyn smiling, holding baby Ethan. They looked alive, radiant. He ran his thumb across the glass. He realized he hadn't smiled like that since she died. Outside, down the hallway, he could hear Sophia's faint humming drifting from Ethan's room. The sound carried warmth he thought he'd buried forever. He closed his eyes and let the melody sink in. For the first time in years, Charles Whitmore didn't feel like the richest man in Ravenshire. He felt like a father again, quietly learning how to love from the maid who refused to give up on silence. The following morning, the sky over Whitmore Estate was a dull silver, heavy with the promise of rain. The world outside looked as if it too carried grief. Inside, Sophia continued her quiet rituals, polishing the glass frames on the hallway walls, folding the freshly laundered curtains, checking on Ethan without expectation. That day she found him by the window again. But something was different. His eyes weren't fixed on emptiness. They were following movement, the faint sway of trees outside as wind brushed through the branches. She said nothing. She just stood behind him, watching in silence. For the first time, she saw a sign of life that wasn't forced or accidental. Ethan's breathing was slower, calmer. His gaze lingered. Sophia took a deep breath and whispered, "You see that? The wind always finds a way to move things, even when they've been still for too long." He didn't respond, but his eyes blinked twice, a slow, deliberate motion, and to her, that was enough. Over the next few days, Sophia began to test what drew Ethan's attention. She would place small objects near him, a toy car, a silver spoon, a folded napkin, then quietly shift them and wait. Sometimes his eyes followed, sometimes they didn't, but she never gave up. Meanwhile, Charles Whitmore noticed the subtle changes. He wasn't ready to admit it, but the energy in his home had changed. The silence was still there, but it no longer felt suffocating. There was movement now, footsteps, light conversation, faint sounds of life. Still, Charles watched everything with suspicion. He didn't like losing control. One afternoon, as he was walking through the main hall, he saw something that stopped him mid-step. Sophia was kneeling on the carpet near Ethan's wheelchair, holding up a small flashlight. The light beam danced slowly across the floor. Ethan's eyes followed it, carefully, intently. Charles froze. Sophia moved the beam left. Ethan's eyes shifted. She moved it right. He followed again. Charles stepped closer. "What are you doing?" His voice cut through the air like a blade. Sophia startled, turning toward him. "Just something simple. He's reacting to movement." "Without my permission?" Charles's tone hardened. "You're not a therapist. You have no right to experiment on him." Her voice stayed calm. "I'm not experimenting, Mr. Whitmore. I'm observing." "I said enough." He snapped, his voice echoing through the hall. Ethan flinched. Sophia's eyes softened. "You're scaring him." Charles's jaw tightened, and for a brief second, guilt flickered behind his anger. But pride buried it fast. "Don't touch him again without my instruction," he said coldly, then turned and walked away. Sophia stood there in silence, heart heavy. Ethan's eyes had followed his father until he disappeared down the hall. Then, quietly, they drifted back to her. That night, Sophia couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her small bed in the servants' quarters, the flashlight still in her hand. She felt foolish. She had only been trying to help, but in this house, hope was treated like rebellion. Her fingers trembled as she packed her small suitcase halfway, ready to leave. But when she looked toward Ethan's room across the dark hall, she couldn't move. She thought about his faint eye movements, his quiet patience, the way he reacted when she hummed. He was trying in his own way, and she couldn't abandon that. Sophia slowly unzipped her bag, placed the flashlight back on the table, and whispered to herself, "Not yet." The next morning, Charles avoided her. He didn't speak, didn't make eye contact, just moved through the estate with cold detachment. But the guilt from the night before followed him like a shadow. He found himself standing by the doorway of Ethan's chamber, watching from a distance. Sophia was there again, quiet and focused. She was reading softly from a children's book. Ethan's hands rested on his lap, still and motionless, but his eyes flicked toward her every time she turned a page. Charles felt something shift in his chest, that same ache that used to rise when he watched Evelyn read to Ethan. It had been years since he'd seen that kind of peace in his son's eyes, but he said nothing. He just walked away again, telling himself that observation wasn't connection, that this woman's presence didn't matter. He was wrong. Later that week, Sophia noticed a small wooden box in Charles's office while dusting. Inside, several pill bottles sat neatly lined up, each labeled with Ethan's name. The handwriting was Charles's. The doctor listed on the labels was Dr. Vincent Rourke. Sophia frowned. She recognized some of the names, powerful sedatives, meant to dull emotion and slow response time. That night, after her shift, she searched the drug names on her old phone. Her heart sank as she read the descriptions: severe drowsiness, cognitive suppression, long-term dependency. Ethan wasn't just recovering from trauma, he was trapped in a chemical fog. She sat in silence, the glow from her phone screen reflecting in her eyes. No wonder he never spoke, she whispered. Sophia knew she had to be careful. If Charles thought she was interfering, he'd fire her instantly. She couldn't risk that, not yet. So she began to plan. The next few days she started giving Ethan his medicine slightly later, delaying each dose by a few minutes at a time. Not enough for anyone to notice, just enough to let his body breathe between the chemicals, and the difference was subtle but real. His eyes stayed open longer. His breathing steadied. He began tracking movement with more clarity. One evening, as Sophia was dusting near the window, she dropped a small spoon accidentally. The metal clinked softly against the floor. Ethan's fingers twitched. Sophia froze. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. He was looking directly at her. Her heart raced. "It's okay," she said softly. "It's just a sound." He blinked twice. She smiled. A small, silent victory. That same night, Charles sat alone, his drink untouched again. The memory of Sophia's defiance haunted him. He hated that she challenged him. He hated that she was changing things without permission. But more than that, he hated the part of himself that felt relief whenever she was near Ethan. He couldn't deny what he'd seen, the faint signs of awareness in his son, the calm that followed Sophia's presence. It made him question everything he believed about hopelessness, and the truth frightened him more than grief ever did. The next morning, as Charles walked past the main hall, he stopped again. Sophia was sitting beside Ethan, quietly humming that same lullaby she'd been humming for weeks. The boy's eyes were half closed. His breathing was steady. Charles didn't speak. He just stood there, watching. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't hurt. It healed. He turned away slowly, unable to understand what was happening, but unwilling to stop it. The maid he'd hired to clean the dust had begun to clean the pain instead. It was a soft morning rain that woke Sophia that day, the kind that painted the windows with silver lines and filled the air with the scent of wet earth. She rose early, as always, and made her way through the quiet corridors of Whitmore Estate. Down the hallway, the staff were whispering about something, about how the boy had smiled the night before. Sophia didn't ask questions. She knew gossip had its way of twisting truth, and yet something inside her hoped it was real. When she entered Ethan's chamber, he was already awake. His gaze wasn't on the floor or the window this time. It was on her. For a fleeting second, their eyes met, and though it lasted no longer than a heartbeat, she saw it, awareness. Sophia smiled faintly. "Good morning," she whispered, placing a small stack of books on the table beside him. He didn't respond, of course, but his head tilted ever so slightly toward the sound of her voice. Over the next few days, Sophia kept her new pattern of observation. She noticed that when she spoke softly, Ethan's eyes seemed to respond to tone more than words. So, she began telling him little stories. Stories about the weather, about her walk through the back courtyard, about the way sunlight hit the rain puddles. Her words didn't ask for anything. They were simply offerings to fill the silence. Sometimes she read to him from her notebook. "When I was a child," she said one morning, "my little brother used to sit near the window for hours, just like you. He never said much, but he noticed everything. The way leaves moved, how shadows changed. You remind me of him." Ethan's fingers twitched at the mention of her brother. Sophia pretended not to notice, but inside, something in her chest loosened. That afternoon, while she was dusting the bookshelf, she began humming again, the same lullaby she always did, the one she never sang for anyone else. The sound drifted softly through the air, low and warm. Ethan blinked, slowly closing his eyes as the hum carried on. His face relaxed. For the first time in months, his body seemed to rest. Sophia continued for a minute more before stopping. "You like that one, don't you?" she whispered. He didn't move, but his breathing deepened, peaceful and calm. Down the hall, Charles Whitmore stood in silence, watching through the barely open door. He had come to tell Sophia something, to remind her not to cross boundaries again. But when he saw her sitting there, humming softly to his son, he couldn't speak. He had seen therapists come and go, doctors who promised progress but delivered nothing but new prescriptions and empty hope. But this woman, she had done something none of them could. She had made Ethan feel safe. Charles leaned against the wall, unsure what to do with the strange ache in his chest. It was envy, maybe, or shame, or both. He turned away quietly before she could notice him. That night, Sophia sat alone in her small room, staring at her notebook. Her notes had grown longer. She was tracking patterns now. How Ethan blinked when she hummed certain notes. How he seemed calmer in the mornings. How his gaze followed light more consistently. She was beginning to understand him, piece by piece, like assembling a puzzle without a picture to guide her. And yet, she couldn't shake the unease. She kept thinking about those pills in Charles's office, about the name on the labels, Dr. Vincent Rourke. She had looked up everything she could find. Most of it was buried in medical archives, hidden behind paywalls. But the few bits she uncovered were enough to scare her. Rourke had once been a respected neurologist, until he was accused of unethical treatments. She didn't know the details, but it was enough to confirm her fear. Something wasn't right. She stared at Ethan's sleeping form through the cracked door across the hall. The boy's breathing was shallow but steady. "I'll fix this," she whispered to herself, "even if I have to do it alone." The next morning, Charles called Sophia to his office. The air between them felt heavy. He motioned toward the chair across his desk. "Sit," Sophia obeyed quietly. "I've noticed changes in Ethan," he began. "He seems different lately." Sophia nodded. "He's becoming more aware." Charles folded his hands. "Is that because of you?" Her voice remained calm. "Maybe it's because someone finally stopped treating him like a case file." He frowned. "You think I haven't tried?" "I think you stopped believing Mr. Whitmore," she said softly. "That's different." For a long moment, neither spoke. Rain tapped against the window behind him, the only sound filling the silence. Finally, Charles said, "I don't want you changing his routine. No music, no singing, no experiments." "Understood?" Sophia hesitated. "If you take away what comforts him, you'll lose the only connection he's made in years." Charles's jaw tightened. "He's my son," Sophia's eyes met his. "Then act like it." The words hung in the air like thunder. Charles didn't respond. He just turned away, dismissing her with a silent wave. Sophia stood, her heart pounding, and walked toward the door. Before she left, she said quietly, "You hired me to clean your house, Mr. Whitmore, but your son doesn't need a clean house. He needs a reason to stay in it." And then she left him alone with his thoughts. For the rest of the day, Charles couldn't concentrate. Every word she said replayed in his mind, sharp as glass. He wasn't angry at her, not really. He was angry at himself. Angry because she was right. He had spent years locking his grief behind pride, convincing himself that hopelessness was strength. But watching Sophia made him realize something painful. She was doing for his son what he had been too afraid to do. She was trying. Late that night, Charles found himself outside Ethan's chamber again. Sophia was already asleep, and the boy sat half awake in his chair. Charles approached slowly. "Hey," he whispered. "It's me." No response. He sat down anyway, resting his hand on Ethan's arm. The boy didn't flinch, but his eyes moved faintly toward the touch. Charles swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," he said softly, "for everything." The words were quiet, trembling. But in that moment, they filled the room. Across the hallway, Sophia stirred. She hadn't meant to listen, but his voice carried softly through the door. For the first time since arriving, she heard something different in Charles Whitmore's tone. Not authority, not guilt. Just love. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this house still had a chance to heal. The next morning, sunlight crept across the marble floors of Whitmore Estate, soft and golden. It slipped through the tall windows, touching the corners of rooms that had long forgotten warmth. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel entirely hollow. Sophia moved through the halls with quiet focus, her apron folded neatly, her notebook tucked under her arm. As she passed the grand staircase, she heard something faint, a sound she hadn't heard before. It was laughter, a short, breathy sound that barely lasted 2 seconds, but it was there. She froze. It came from Ethan's chamber. Heart racing, she hurried toward the room and found him sitting in his wheelchair, a book resting on his lap. The book wasn't open. He was simply touching the cover with the tips of his fingers. Sophia smiled gently. "You like that one?" she asked softly. He didn't answer, but she could see the trace of something on his face, a flicker of emotion that wasn't emptiness. It wasn't a smile, not really, but it was life. Over the following days, Sophia noticed Ethan responding more, small things at first, his gaze following movement, his fingers twitching when she hummed, his breathing changing when she entered the room. Then came something new. He began to make small sounds, barely audible at first, broken whispers that carried no shape, just air and effort. Sophia said nothing. She knew not to pressure him. Instead, she continued her routine, talking to him as she always did, her voice soft and steady. One afternoon, while dusting the window, she heard it clearly for the first time. "Ah, Ma." Her hands froze mid-air. She turned slowly. Ethan's lips trembled. His eyes were wide, unsure, as if he was afraid of what had just come out of him. Sophia swallowed hard. "It's okay," she whispered. "Say it again." He tried, mouth opening faintly. "Ah, Ma." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "That's good, Ethan, that's so good. It wasn't a word. Not yet, but it was sound. It was connection. It was proof that he still existed beneath the silence." That night, Charles Whitmore stood at the door of his office, holding a glass of water that had long gone warm. He'd heard the sound earlier, too. He hadn't believed it until one of the maids confirmed it. "He said something," she'd whispered, eyes wide with astonishment. Charles had wanted to rush to Ethan's room, but fear held him back. Fear that hope might once again be snatched away. He stayed there, in the dim glow of his desk lamp, staring at the wall of photographs. Evelyn, Ethan, and himself, frozen in happier times. He pressed a hand against the frame and whispered to no one. "He spoke, Evie. He really spoke." His voice cracked, and for a long moment, the man who had built empires couldn't hold himself together. Over the next few days, Sophia began noticing patterns in Ethan's voice attempts. He often made sounds when she was near, rarely when others were, so she started narrating small actions aloud. "Dusting the window now," she would say softly. folding the blanket, wiping the table, and Ethan would respond, not with words, but with quiet sounds, breaths that felt like effort made visible. Once, when she bent to pick up a fallen toy car, he smiled. A real smile this time, faint but unmistakable. Sophia's chest tightened with emotion. She wanted to run down the hall and tell Charles, to show him that his son was coming back piece by piece. But she didn't. Some things needed to grow in silence. Later that week, while organizing Charles's office, Sophia noticed the same wooden box of pill bottles again. This time there were fewer. She frowned. Either Charles was giving Ethan less, or she was being watched. Still, she couldn't stop worrying. Every instinct told her something about those medications was wrong. That night, she took photos of the labels and sent them to an old friend, Dr. Alice Monroe, a medical researcher she hadn't spoken to in years. The next evening, Alice called back, her tone grave. "Sophia, where did you find these?" "In my employer's study. They're prescribed to the boy I'm caring for," Alice sighed. "These drugs are dangerous. They're experimental sedatives, pulled from circulation years ago. Most doctors don't even know they exist. The name, Dr. Vincent Rourke, he's been blacklisted. He lost his license after multiple malpractice investigations." Sophia's blood ran cold. "Malpractice? What kind?" "Unapproved tests. He used high-dose sedatives on children to stabilize emotional trauma. It destroyed most of them cognitively. Some never recovered." Sophia's grip on her phone tightened. "Oh my God," Alice's voice softened. "If the boy's been taking this for years, his system's been numbed. Be careful, Sophia. If you stop suddenly, withdrawal could be severe. Do this slowly." Sophia nodded, though Alice couldn't see her. "I will. Thank you." When the call ended, she sat there in the dark, the phone glowing faintly in her lap. Her hands trembled. Everything made sense now. The dull eyes, the emotionless face, the fog that hung over Ethan's mind. He wasn't unresponsive by nature. He was being chemically silenced. The next morning, Sophia didn't say anything to Charles. Not yet. He needed to see before he would believe. She began a careful plan, reducing each dose ever so slightly, letting Ethan's system breathe a little more each day, and it worked. At first, the changes were small. Ethan's eyes stayed focused longer. He blinked at sounds more quickly. His body stopped slumping as often. Then, one afternoon, as Sophia sat beside him telling a story about her childhood, she said something funny about how her brother once painted their dog green. Ethan's lips twitched. Then came something she hadn't heard in years, a quiet, soft giggle. It broke through the air like sunlight through clouds. Sophia froze, tears rushing to her eyes. She didn't say anything. She didn't want to scare the moment away. When she finally looked at him, Ethan was still smiling. That night, Charles found himself standing outside the door again. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but when he heard that faint laughter, he stopped breathing. It wasn't loud, it wasn't strong, but it was real. He stepped closer to the door, placing a hand against the frame as if steadying himself. The boy who hadn't laughed since his mother's death had laughed again. Something broke inside him. The guilt, the denial, the false strength he'd built to survive. For the first time in years, Charles Whitmore let himself cry. Inside, Sophia continued talking softly, unaware of the man in the hallway. Ethan blinked at her, calm and present. Sophia leaned forward and whispered, "You're doing so well. Your mom would be so proud." The boy's eyes glistened, and though no words came, the look he gave her was enough. It was the look of someone who finally believed that life might be worth returning to. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life inside Whitmore Estate began to shift completely. The stillness that once haunted the halls now hummed with something subtle: movement, sound, warmth. Ethan was no longer the silent statue he used to be. He smiled faintly when Sophia entered, turned his head when she called his name, and even tried to lift small objects. Every little action felt like a miracle reborn. Sophia, though exhausted from long hours, found herself smiling more than she had in years. Each small breakthrough reminded her why she was there, to prove that broken things could still heal if someone refused to give up on them. But Charles Whitmore didn't know what to do with what he was seeing. He had spent years convincing himself that hope was cruel. Now, hope was sitting across the hall, humming softly to his son, and he didn't know how to live with it. One afternoon, Charles stood outside Ethan's chamber, listening. Sophia's voice drifted through the door, soft and patient, as she guided Ethan through a gentle exercise. "Now, hold it," she said, lifting a small red ball in front of him. "You don't have to move much, just look." Ethan blinked once, his gaze steady. "Good," she said quietly. "Now follow." She moved the ball to the side, slow and deliberate. Ethan's eyes followed. Charles couldn't help but step inside. "What is this?" he asked, though his voice came out gentler than he intended. Sophia turned, startled but composed. "It's visual tracking. It helps his focus and control. You're doing therapy again." "I'm doing what works," she said firmly. Charles crossed his arms. "And if it doesn't?" "Then I'll try again tomorrow," she replied simply. Her tone wasn't defensive, it was certain. That certainty unsettled him more than defiance ever could. He opened his mouth to argue, but stopped. Ethan's eyes were still moving, tracking the ball. For the first time, Charles realized the exercise wasn't theory. It was progress. He swallowed hard, his voice lower now. "You really think he can come back from this?" Sophia's gaze softened. "He already is." Charles stood in silence for a long time, his chest tightening with emotions he didn't have names for. Then, quietly, he left the room without another word. That night, Sophia couldn't shake the tension in the air. She knew Charles was struggling, not because he doubted her, but because he doubted himself. In the stillness of her small room, she thought of him, of the man who had lost everything and then chosen to stop feeling, the man whose heart was locked in the same silence his son lived in. She didn't pity him. She understood him. Loss had shaped her too. 2 days later, everything changed. Sophia was cleaning near Charles's office when she noticed something new. The box of medications, the same one she had photographed, was gone. In its place sat an empty glass jar and a sealed envelope. Her pulse quickened. When Charles entered, she straightened immediately. "I threw them out," he said quietly, before she could ask. "All of them. Every pill." Sophia froze. "You... what?" "I called in a medical team," he continued. "They'll monitor Ethan while the drugs leave his system." "You were right. Those pills were killing him slowly." Her eyes widened. "You looked into it?" "I did." His voice cracked slightly. "I found old case reports. That man, Rourke, he's a monster. I trusted him because he promised peace." He paused, swallowing hard. "But peace bought through silence isn't peace, is it?" Sophia shook her head, emotion tightening her throat. "No, Mr. Whitmore, it's surrender." Charles nodded faintly. "I've done enough of that." The next few days were hard, brutally hard. Ethan's body went through visible changes as the medication wore off. He slept restlessly, muscles twitching, hands trembling. Sophia barely left his side. She fed him, cleaned him, whispered to him when nightmares broke through the quiet. Charles stayed close too, watching helplessly from the doorway. Every time Ethan's body tensed or whimpered, guilt crushed him like a weight. On the third night, Ethan's breathing became shallow, and Sophia stayed awake until dawn, holding his hand and humming the same lullaby that had once brought him peace. By morning, something changed. When she looked into his eyes, the fog was gone. It was replaced by something new: clarity, awareness. Ethan blinked slowly and then smiled. Not a ghost of one, a real, full smile. Sophia covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. "You did it," she whispered. "You're back. He reached out weakly, touching her hand. Charles saw it from the doorway. His breath caught in his throat. For the first time since the accident, he felt like the house had air again. As the days passed, Ethan's strength returned little by little. His hands stopped trembling, his eyes brightened. The boy who once stared at walls now pointed toward things, reached for objects, reacted to sounds. Sophia documented everything in her notebook. Day 3 without medication, steady focus. Day 5, smiling spontaneously. Day 6, attempted word formation. Every night, she shared updates with Charles. He listened intently, saying little but absorbing every word. One evening, as she finished her report, he asked quietly, "How do you do it?" "Do what?" "Stay so calm," Sophia smiled faintly. "Because if I panic, he'll feel it. He listens to everything, even silence." Charles studied her face, then said softly, "You're remarkable, Sophia." She looked down, not out of modesty, but because praise wasn't what she worked for. "He's the remarkable one. I'm just reminding him who he is." Charles didn't respond, but something in his gaze had changed. Something warmer, something grateful. By the end of the week, Ethan was sitting up without help. He began forming simple sounds again, this time stronger, clearer. When Sophia showed him a bright red toy car, he whispered, "Car." Her eyes filled instantly. She wanted to shout for joy, but instead she simply said, "Yes, that's right." From behind, Charles let out a choked breath. His hand trembled as he covered his mouth. Sophia turned and met his eyes. For the first time since she arrived, she saw him smile, not forced, not polite, but real, the kind of smile that said, "Thank you," without words. That night, when the house was finally quiet, Sophia stood by the window of her small room, looking out over the estate. The rain had stopped. The garden glistened faintly beneath the moonlight. In the reflection of the glass, she saw herself, tired, worn, but at peace. She whispered softly, "You did good today." She wasn't sure if she was talking to Ethan or to herself. Maybe both. Down the hall, in his office, Charles sat staring at the empty pill bottles in a sealed bag on his desk. He ran his hand over them one last time before tossing the bag into the fireplace. The flames rose high, swallowing the past in a quiet roar. For the first time in years, he didn't feel trapped by his house or by guilt. He felt free. The Whitmore estate had changed. For the first time in years, it sounded alive. Voices echoed through the halls again, soft laughter from the staff, quiet conversations near the dining room, the clinking of dishes that had once been muted by grief. It wasn't sudden. Healing never is. It came slowly, like dawn crawling over a long night. Ethan's recovery became the silent heartbeat of the house. Every morning, Sophia found new fragments of progress, his grip a little stronger, his voice a little clearer, his eyes a little brighter. And Charles, he was changing too. He no longer spent entire days hidden in his office. Now he sat beside his son during breakfast, even helped Sophia set up small activities. Sometimes he spoke, sometimes he just watched. But the silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was alive with possibility. One morning, Sophia arrived in Ethan's chamber to find him holding one of her notebooks. It was open to a page filled with scribbles, small reminders and notes about his progress. "Hey," she said softly, approaching him. "That's mine, you little thief." For the first time, he smiled on purpose. Sophia. Her breath caught. She dropped to her knees beside him. "What did you say?" He hesitated, then said it again, clearer this time. "Sophia." It was barely above a whisper, but it felt like thunder. She covered her mouth, her eyes flooding. That's my name," she said, her voice trembling. "You said my name." Ethan nodded slowly, the corners of his lips lifting. When Charles entered moments later, he froze at the sight, Sophia crying, Ethan smiling, both lost in the impossible beauty of that single word. What happened? he asked, his voice shaking slightly. Sophia turned toward him, tears streaking her cheeks. He said my name. Charles looked at his son, eyes wide. "Say it again, Ethan." Ethan blinked, looked at Sophia and whispered, "Sophia." Charles pressed a hand against his mouth, tears forming before he could stop them. "Oh, God." He turned away, shoulders trembling as silent sobs broke free. For years, he'd thought his son's voice was gone forever. Now, hearing it again, it felt like time itself had forgiven him. Sophia stood quietly behind him. "He's coming back, Mr. Whitmore. You just have to keep believing it." Charles nodded, wiping his face. "I do. I finally do." Days turned to weeks, and Ethan's speech improved little by little. His words were short, sometimes shaky, but each one was a victory. Sophia guided him gently, never rushing. "Don't force it," she would say. "Just breathe and try." He often mimicked her expressions when she spoke, watching her mouth carefully, learning the rhythm of conversation. Sometimes he said small things like "good" or "yes." Once, when she asked if he liked the music, he whispered, "happy." That word alone made her heart ache. Charles, meanwhile, struggled to balance the flood of emotion with guilt that still haunted him. He spent long nights sitting by the fireplace, revisiting memories of Evelyn, her laugh, her touch, the way she used to hum when holding Ethan as a baby. He found her old jewelry box one evening while cleaning. Inside was a folded letter, worn and slightly yellow. He almost didn't open it, but when he did, he froze. It was addressed to him. The handwriting was hers. "If I'm not here, promise me one thing," it read. "Let others love him. Don't keep him locked away from warmth. He deserves more than one heart to hold him." Charles pressed the letter to his chest, tears streaming down his face. The words felt like a whisper from beyond time, his wife reminding him what love truly meant. The next morning, he found Sophia in the main hall, helping Ethan stand with support. The boy's legs trembled, his hands gripping the sides of the chair for balance. Charles froze, fear and awe battling inside him. Sophia's voice was calm but firm. "You can do it, Ethan, just one step. That's all." He wobbled, hesitating. Charles instinctively moved forward. "Careful, he can't." Sophia didn't even look at him. "Yes, he can." Ethan took a deep breath. His muscles quivered, his arms shook, but slowly, painfully, his body began to rise. Charles's heart stopped. Sophia didn't touch him. She stood close but let him fight. Ethan's legs straightened. His knees trembled. He swayed for a second, and then, miraculously, he stood. Sophia's eyes filled instantly, but she didn't speak. She knew the power of silence. Ethan's lips parted, his breathing heavy. He looked at her and whispered, "Mommy." Charles felt his knees buckle. Sophia knelt quickly beside Ethan, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm here," she said softly. He leaned into her arms, exhausted but smiling. Charles stood there, frozen in the doorway, every breath trembling. The sound of that word, "Mommy," cut through years of grief. It wasn't just about Ethan mistaking Sophia for his mother. It was about what she had become, the source of comfort, of love, of hope reborn. That night, Charles didn't sleep. He sat in his study, staring at the rain outside, his mind replaying the image of Ethan, standing, his small frame defying everything doctors had said. He finally understood what Sophia had been doing all along. She hadn't just been healing Ethan, she'd been healing him too. All the anger, the guilt, the isolation, she had quietly dismantled it without asking for anything in return. By giving Ethan love, she had forced Charles to remember how to feel it again. The next morning, as Sophia served breakfast, Charles joined her and Ethan at the table. The air between them felt new, lighter, almost fragile. Ethan looked up, his voice faint but clear. "Dad." Charles froze, then looked at Sophia as if to confirm he'd heard it right. She smiled softly. "You heard him," Charles exhaled shakily, eyes glistening. "Yeah, I did." For the first time, Charles reached across the table, took his son's hand and said, "I missed you." Ethan smiled. "Missed you?" Sophia looked away, blinking rapidly to hide her tears. The silence that followed wasn't grief anymore. It was peace. Later that day, when Sophia returned to her small room, she wrote a single line in her notebook before closing it. "The house doesn't echo anymore." She set the notebook aside and looked out the window. The once grey garden shimmered under the morning light. For the first time since she arrived, she didn't feel like a maid in a stranger's home. She felt like part of a family learning how to live again. The days that followed felt like a different lifetime inside Whitmore Estate. The air was lighter, the rooms warmer, and the laughter, though rare, was real. For the first time since Evelyn's death, the home didn't carry the sound of mourning. It carried the rhythm of rebirth. Ethan's progress was slow but constant. Every day brought something new, a word, a reaction, a movement. He could now push his wheelchair forward with steady arms, though his legs still trembled when he tried to stand. His voice, once fragile and broken, grew steadier, shaped by Sophia's endless patience. And Charles, who had once lived behind walls of grief, began to let light back into his life. He joined them for breakfast, helped with exercises, and sometimes even laughed. It was hesitant at first, but it was real. The sound startled even him, Sophia noticed. She never mentioned it, but she saw how his shoulders sat lighter, how his eyes no longer looked hollow. He was changing. One afternoon, while cleaning the main hall, Sophia overheard the faint sound of piano keys being pressed. Her heart froze. The piano had been silent since Evelyn died. She walked closer, every step slow, unsure if what she heard was real. Inside, she found Charles seated at the piano. The lid was half open, his fingers resting on the keys, uncertain but steady. He looked up when he saw her, startled but not embarrassed. "I don't really remember how to play," he said softly. "She used to." She was the one with the music. Sophia smiled faintly. "You don't have to remember the notes, Mr. Whitmore. Just remember the feeling." He hesitated, then pressed a key. A single note echoed through the room. Dust rose like memory from the strings. He played another, then another. The sound was clumsy, uneven, but alive. Ethan watched from across the room, his eyes wide, as if the music was something sacred he hadn't known he missed. Sophia leaned against the doorway, listening. The melody wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. It was enough. For the first time in years, Evelyn's piano was singing again. Later that evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Charles found Sophia sitting quietly in the back courtyard, her notebook open, pen resting on her lap. He stood behind her for a moment before saying, "You've done something I didn't think was possible." She didn't look up. "It wasn't just me." Charles took a seat beside her, careful not to interrupt the quiet rhythm of the night. "When Evelyn was alive," he began, "I thought I understood what family meant. But I only understood happiness, not survival." He paused. "You taught me the difference." Sophia's gaze stayed on the fountain in front of them, where moonlight rippled across the surface. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just stayed." Charles nodded slowly. "That's exactly what no one else did." There was a long silence between them, soft and heavy with gratitude. Then he said quietly, "You're not just part of this house anymore, Sophia. You're part of what saved it." Her throat tightened, but she said nothing. The next morning, the newspaper carried a headline that caught Charles's eye as he sat at the dining table. "Disgraced neurologist Vincent Rourke found guilty of medical fraud and abuse." Charles read the article in silence, his jaw tightening with every line. The man who had given him those pills, the man who had promised peace through sedation, had been manipulating families, using children as test subjects. The report detailed everything: the illegal prescriptions, The sedatives, the lives ruined. When he finished reading, he folded the paper neatly and stood. Sophia looked up from the kitchen counter. "Everything all right?" Charles exhaled slowly. "He's been arrested." Her eyes widened. "Rourke?" He nodded. "It's over." Sophia's hand trembled slightly on the countertop. "Good." For a long moment they both stood in silence. No triumph, no satisfaction, just quiet relief. Then Charles said softly, "I was part of his mistake. I trusted him. I let him numb my son." Sophia shook her head. "You were a father in pain. That's not a crime. What matters is you fixed it." Charles looked at her with something between admiration and sorrow. "No, you fixed it." Sophia smiled gently. "Maybe we both did." Later that afternoon, Sophia helped Ethan practice standing again. The progress was slow but sure. His legs, once frail and unresponsive, now carried weight for short moments. She stood close, her hands ready but never interfering. "Breathe, Ethan," she said softly. "One step, that's all." He nodded faintly, determination in his eyes. His arms shook, his knees trembled, but he stood again. Charles entered quietly, watching from the doorway. Sophia met his gaze briefly and smiled. "He's getting stronger." Charles nodded, but his voice broke slightly when he said, "I know." He took a few steps closer and knelt beside his son. "You're doing amazing, Ethan." Ethan smiled weakly and whispered, "Dad." Charles froze, tears welling instantly. "Say that again." "Dad." Charles closed his eyes, a tear rolling down his cheek. He reached forward and placed a trembling hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm right here, son. Always." Sophia turned away, her heart too full for words. That night, the entire estate felt lighter. The staff whispered that the curse had lifted, that the house no longer felt haunted. In truth, it was never cursed. It had simply been waiting for its people to start living again. Charles joined Sophia and Ethan in the living room. The television played softly in the background, the glow washing over them in warm light. Ethan leaned against Sophia's arm, half asleep. Charles looked at them, this small, fragile image of peace, and realized something simple but profound. This was family, not the kind built by blood or perfection, but by survival and choice. He smiled faintly. "Sophia," he said quietly. She looked up. "Yes?" "Thank you." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at Ethan, sleeping peacefully beside her, his small hand resting on hers. Then she met Charles's eyes and said softly, "You don't thank family." For the first time in a decade, Charles Whitmore went to sleep without the sound of guilt echoing through his mind. And outside, the garden that had once wilted in neglect bloomed quietly under the night sky. Weeks passed and Whitmore Estate had fully transformed. The halls that once echoed with loneliness now carried laughter, music, and conversation. Ethan's recovery, though still gradual, had become something miraculous to witness. He spoke in short sentences now, his voice soft but steady. Every new word was a victory. Sophia guided him daily, blending care with patience. What once felt like therapy had become life itself. Simple, natural, filled with moments that no one dared to hope for again. Charles, too, had changed. He wasn't the silent man behind closed doors anymore. He spent mornings in the main hall with Ethan, helping with reading lessons, even joking occasionally. For the first time since Evelyn's death, he seemed alive. One rainy evening, Charles entered the kitchen to find Sophia making tea. The warmth of the fire cast a golden hue over her face. "You should rest," he said softly. "You've done enough for one day." She smiled faintly. "You don't stop being family when the day ends." The word family made his chest tighten. "Is that what we are now?" She met his eyes gently. "What else could we be?" Charles didn't reply, but the silence between them was full of understanding. The next morning, Ethan woke up before Sophia arrived. When she entered, she found him standing with support, his small frame trembling but upright. He grinned when he saw her. "Mommy, look!" Sophia froze. Her throat tightened as she knelt beside him. "You did it, Ethan," she whispered, voice breaking. "You really did." From the doorway, Charles stood motionless, his eyes wide. He didn't move, didn't speak. The moment was sacred. For years he had imagined miracles like this, then stopped believing in them. But now, watching his son stand on his own, he felt every wall inside him collapse. He turned away, covering his face as tears fell freely. That evening the storm returned, wind howling across the estate. A power outage left the house in near darkness. Thunder boomed as lightning flickered through the windows. Ethan panicked, calling out through tears. Charles froze, unsure what to do, his instincts paralyzed by fear. But Sophia was already there. She rushed to him, wrapping her arms around his trembling frame. "It's okay," she whispered. "I've got you." Her voice turned into a soft hum, the lullaby. The same melody that had carried him through silence and storms before. Slowly, Ethan's cries faded. His head rested on her shoulder, his body relaxing as her voice soothed the chaos around them. Charles watched from the shadows, tears streaming silently. He had spent years trying to fix his son with doctors and money, but she had healed him with something far simpler, love that never left. When the lights returned, Sophia was still holding Ethan. Charles stepped closer, his voice trembling. "Thank you," he whispered. Sophia looked up, eyes glistening. "You don't have to thank me," but he did anyway. "You brought him back. You brought us back." She didn't answer, only held Ethan closer as thunder rolled gently in the distance. And for the first time, the storm outside felt peaceful. Months passed, and the transformation inside Whitmore Estate was complete. The rooms that once felt like tombs were now alive with warmth and sound. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread again, music floated through the halls, and laughter replaced the old silence that used to cling to every wall. Ethan no longer needed his wheelchair all the time. He walked short distances on his own, his small steps filled with courage. Every morning he ran, sometimes stumbled into Sophia's arms, calling her name with joy that echoed through the house. Charles often stood at the doorway during those moments, smiling quietly. His heart, once burdened by guilt, now carried peace. Watching them together felt like watching a promise fulfilled, a family rebuilt from the ruins of loss. One afternoon, Sophia received a phone call from Ravenshire Institute, the specialized school that had reached out weeks earlier. They wanted her to join their child development program as a lead assistant. It was the kind of offer she had dreamed of for years. She stood in silence after the call, torn. It was everything she had worked for, but it would mean leaving Ethan, leaving the home that had become her heart. For days, she said nothing, but Charles noticed her distance, the way her smiles didn't reach her eyes, the way she lingered longer at the window, lost in thought. Finally, one evening he spoke. "You've been quiet lately," Sophia hesitated. "I got an offer from Ravenshire Institute." He paused, already understanding the weight of her words. "It's a good opportunity," she nodded. "It is." Ethan, sitting nearby, looked between them. "You go?" Sophia's chest tightened. She knelt beside him, brushing his hair gently. "I don't know yet, sweetheart." His eyes filled with tears. "Mommy, stay." The words shattered her. She hugged him tightly, whispering through tears, "I'll always be here." "Ethan, no matter what." Charles stood silently behind them, his face unreadable, but inside, something broke. That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Charles found Sophia in the kitchen, cleaning in silence. He approached slowly, voice low and steady. "I know about the offer," he said. She didn't look up. "I was going to tell you." "I know." There was a long pause. Then he added, "You deserve it. You've given everything to this house. To us." Sophia set the cloth down and turned toward him. "This isn't just a job anymore, Mr. Whitmore. This place, Ethan, it's family." Charles nodded. "Then stay. Not as an employee, as family." Sophia froze, her breath catching. Charles reached into his pocket and handed her a small letter. "I found this in Evelyn's jewelry box," he said quietly. She unfolded it. The faded handwriting read, "If I'm not here, let others love Leo. Don't build walls around his heart. Let someone hold him the way he deserves." Tears streamed down Sophia's cheeks. "She knew," Charles nodded. "She did. And I think she sent you." In that moment, no words were needed. Sophia's answer was clear. She stayed. Months later, the estate hosted its first celebration in years. Ethan's school had organized a small event where each child shared something special on stage. When Ethan's turn came, he walked carefully to the center, holding a small sign in shaky hands. It read, "We love you, Mommy Sophia." The room erupted in applause. Sophia covered her mouth, tears flowing freely as Charles stood beside her, smiling through his own. Then, as if guided by memory, Ethan began to hum her lullaby. The same song that once filled the darkness of his silence now filled the room with light. Sophia joined in quietly. Charles did too. Their voices weren't perfect, but together they were whole. That night, back at the Whitmore estate, the three of them sat together in the living room. Ethan lay asleep between them, his small hand resting over both theirs. Charles looked around the home that had once been drenched in sorrow. "It's different now," he said softly. Sophia smiled. "Because it's finally alive," he nodded. "No, because it's finally home." And for the first time in years, the house didn't just stand in silence. It breathed.